Hey, you sister students, hope you're doing well. Today we're in our fifth part of American foreign policy during the Cold War era. And today we're going to focus in on the Vietnam War. All right, so a little bit of background on how Vietnam got to the point where a war breaks out. Well, in 1954, there's a conference in Geneva, Switzerland, among several countries kind of dealing with the aftermath of the Korean War and dealing with this section of the world, what we call Indochina, where Vietnam is located. And it was determined that it would be best to divide into two separate states for the time being, and then in 1956 to hold elections and reunite. So in the north, it was going to be a communist state, and it was controlled by the leader Ho Chi Minh. And the South was a pro-Western state. We call it a pro-Western state because it is not a democracy, but it is supported by the U.S. And the goal is to reunify in the near future. Okay. Now there are those living in the South that want communism to be the government type of South Vietnam. And those people we call the Viet Cong. These are people living in South Vietnam. They are communists in South Vietnam. They began a war against the South Vietnamese government to change the government to communism. And the North began to help them. So they're going to try to reunite the country under communism. The South tried to fight them off, but they weren't very successful. These communist fighters, the Viet Cong, are using what we call guerrilla warfare, which is very unorganized. It's kind of ambush methods. They're going to hide out. They created these tunnel systems where they could travel around the country undetected and hide out very easily in the dense jungles. And so it was very difficult to fight off these guerrilla fighters. So just keep in mind, the North wants communism. The North is a communist state. The Southern government does not want communism. It is not a communist state. But the Viet Cong is a group in South Vietnam that does want communism, and they are fighting to overthrow the South in order to unite the country under communism, and the North helps them. So where does the U.S. come in? Well, the U.S. comes in with our policy of containment. So remember, containment. We do not want communism to spread. We want to keep it contained. Eisenhower embraced a theory known as domino theory. So just imagine you stack a row of dominoes, kind of like you see here on the page, and if you start to knock the first one over, they will all continue to fall. This was the idea that if you allowed one country to fall to communism, it would just knock all the rest around them over until all fell to communism. This policy was continued by Kennedy. He continued to give aid to South Vietnam to help them resist the North and not fall to communism. Things start to escalate under President Johnson. So we had two presidents before Johnson, Eisenhower and Kennedy, that were involved in Vietnam somewhat. President Johnson is the president that actually escalates the war with more U.S. troops. The reasoning for this is he announces that the North Vietnamese attack U.S. ships off the coast of Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin. When he gives this announcement and tells Congress this is what happens, Congress gives Johnson full military powers to retaliate and to stop North Vietnam from overtaking South Vietnam. This is known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Gulf of Tonkin Resolution 1964. This is Congress saying, President Johnson, we are giving you authorization to use military force in Vietnam. President Johnson uses this to massively escalate our involvement and send many more troops to Vietnam. Now we are heavily involved. President Johnson begins with massive bombing raids over Vietnam and sent in an escalation of troops. The bombing raids are known as Operation Rolling Thunder, and the U.S. uses some new weapons in Vietnam. This is a territory we hadn't had much experience fighting in before. So some new technology, we have napalm, which is a sticky gasoline-based jelly that burns. And so they would spray napalm all over villages and areas, and it would just burn to the ground. If you got this on you, it would burn your skin. The U.S. also uses Agent Orange, which is what this plane is doing. It's an herbicide. It's dropping, it's like a high-powered Roundup. If you ever use Roundup in your yard or your garden, it kills plants. So this plane is dropping this on the jungle to kill trees and kill the jungle, so that we can expose the Viet Cong and their hideouts in the jungle and not give them a place to hide. And so by 1968, we had 500,000 U.S. soldiers in Vietnam. So Johnson escalates the war. In 1968, we have a turning point. It's known as the Tet Offensive. The Viet Cong launches a massive attack throughout South Vietnam. This was over the Tet holiday, which is like New Year's in Vietnam. And so it took the U.S. by surprise. It threatened the capital of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. And this is considered a turning point in the war because up to this point, the U.S. government had been saying, hey, we're close to winning this war. We're close, we're close, we're close. We're doing great, we're doing fine. But when the Viet Cong is able to pull off this massive attack and the U.S. is caught off guard, Americans at home realize that victory is not close at hand and that we've got major issues in Vietnam. So the U.S. had been calling the Viet Cong weak and unprepared, but this offensive showed otherwise. This is considered a turning point. We're beginning to lose the war at home in people's opinions and their backing of the war. When we talk about Vietnam, we're going to talk about a man named Roy Benavidez. He is a Medal of Honor winner from the Vietnam War for bravery and courage in war. Under enemy fire, he carried 8 wounded soldiers to rescue helicopter while he was himself shot several times and critically wounded. He did survive, and he did get the Medal of Honor in 1981. So the war begins to start going badly for the United States. The U.S. is not able to win, not able to get major victories. Some of the reasons why the North Vietnamese had and the Viet Cong had such success against the United States is the popularity of Ho Chi Minh and his cause. So Ho Chi Minh is kind of like the equivalent of the United States' George Washington. So we're being attacked by an outside force, and we are wanting our independence, and we're fighting for our independence, and they're also fighting on their own territory, and they're using guerrilla warfare, which the U.S. is not necessarily used to fighting a war against an enemy using guerrilla warfare. And we're unfamiliar with the language, the people, the environment. It's all new and different. And so it's very hard to fight here. And it's hard to make advancements and to get victories. But the U.S. continues on under Johnson, and by the end of 1968, the U.S. had dropped more bombs on Vietnam than it had during all of World War II. Back at home, people are losing the faith against the war. The government kept saying that the U.S. was winning the war. We kept hearing from our president say, hey, victory is at hand. We're getting close. But TV journalists embedded in Vietnam and news reporters are showing otherwise. And they're showing video footage into people's living rooms that are showing U.S. soldiers under fire and getting attacked and not able to win. And so people begin to lose their faith in government. And this is called the credibility gap. So the government is saying one thing, but the people are seeing another thing, and the news is reporting another thing, and so people are losing faith in the government. The government is losing its credibility. And so people began to protest against the war. They would get drafted, and they would burn their draft cards. They would stage protests, and they would speak out against the war. So we see huge protests across the country. Many of them on college campuses, so a lot of young people that were being drafted are refusing to go and fight. So this is a good time to stop and quickly talk about the U.S. counterculture. So going back to the 1950s, we have a group called the Beat Generation who rebelled against conformity. The 2 members that we talk about here, Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, they're writers, They experiment with different things, and they're all about going against conformity and against the common culture. And so they influence the hippies of the 1960s. And basically, the 1960s falls into a group that is counterculture and anti-war, and they're pushing for peace, and they kind of leave mainstream society altogether. They live in these self-sufficient communal communities, and we just see this growing of this anti-war movement, this growing of this anti-conformity movement, this peace movement. And we also see a rise of a rock group called the Beatles, introducing rock and roll, introducing new fashions. And so we see kind of this counterculture emerging during the 50s and 60s. So the anti-war movement also spreads to high schools. And so we see in Iowa, in Des Moines, 2 high school students, John Tinker and his sister, wore these armbands that were black and had the peace sign on them, and they refused to take them off when they were asked to, and so they were suspended from school. They were protesting the Vietnam War. And so the court case, Tinker versus Des Moines, said that the school violated their First Amendment rights, that wearing this armband is a form of expression, a form of free speech, and that the school could not force them to take those off. So moving on in the war under Nixon, in 1968 when he's elected, he begins the policy known as Vietnamization. This is gradually handing over the war to the South Vietnamese to kind of fight on their own. We're slowly pulling the U.S. out. They're going to bear the brunt of the fighting and will allow us to eventually withdraw U.S. troops. Nixon also secretly bombs Cambodia. And so U.S. citizens are shocked when they see this, and more protests erupt. And at Kent State, which is a university in Ohio, protesters are shot and killed by troops. And so this is kind of a tragedy, travesty that's happening due to the protests of the war. So Nixon is insisting that there is support for the war, and he calls these supporters the silent majority. He says most Americans are for the war, they're just not the ones that are speaking out and being loud, and so we don't hear from them. Then in 1971, there's some leaked government documents that become known as the Pentagon Papers, which were leaked to the New York Times, and they printed them, and they show that presidents had actually lied to the public about Vietnam. They had kept saying that we were close to winning, close to winning, close to winning, when in actuality these administrations did not actually believe they could win, but they didn't want to be the ones that lost the war, and so they kept prolonging it and prolonging it. So the United States actually withdraws from the war in 1973. We sign a ceasefire deal with the North, and we pull out. The South continues to fight on without the U.S. In 1975, the South officially falls to North Vietnam. The North takes over the capital of Saigon, and they rename Saigon Ho Chi Minh City. Those that resisted communism and supported the U.S., they faced torture, disease, malnutrition. They were not treated nicely. They were put into the re-education camps in communist Vietnam. So a few legacies of the war. Many Americans died, 58,000. Many that came home, they suffered from psychological effects like PTSD and other mental illnesses. In Korea and Vietnam, presidents send troops into war without a declaration of war from Congress. So this leads to the War Powers Act of 1973, where Congress is trying to take back power from the president, the power to wage war. And so now, under the War Powers Act of 73, the president must notify Congress within 48 hours of sending troops abroad. And so Congress has 60 days to debate it and decide whether to let the troops stay or to force the president to withdraw them. And what the goal of this is to limit presidential power.